We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelming on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Dr. Stephen Leeb, founder of Leeb Capital Management and author of China's Rise and the New Age of Gold, How Investors Can Profit from a Changing World. How are you today, Steve?
I'm fine, Tom. I really am. As fine as you can be in a world like we're living in today. Yes, fine.
Well, of course, we have a lot to talk about. And the last time you and I spoke was, I believe, at the end of May. And I'd like to start off by asking, since then, what have we seen for developments in the BRICS Plus nations moving away from the US dollar as a reserve currency for trading commodities, for trading energy? What are some of those developments?
They've been actually a lot faster than I had expected. There are two organizations which have now become very important and prominent. The most visible has been, I think, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I became aware of. SCO. Mm-hmm. I became aware of the SCO in, I think, 1996, the end of the 90s. And what caught my attention about it is that it was formed originally, probably, maybe even in the 70s, but I think early 80s. And the original members were China, Russia, and three Central Asian countries. I can't remember. I think Kazakhstan was one. And it existed as that 5-country alliance. And its goal was basically security and economic growth. And what struck me initially was the formation of it, because at that time, Russia and China were not such willing bedfellows. I mean, there was a lot that separated them. I mean, different ethnicities, different religions, different political systems, even though, it's convenient to say they're both communists. They're not, I don't think, in any Marxist sense of the word. But, the point is they were different. The Central Asian countries, you could have said, were more kindred to Russia. But then all of a sudden in 96, 97, two new members came and joined the organization together, India and Pakistan. Now, you already have a maybe 6-member organization that consists of religious enemies, massive cultural differences, and totally different political styles. India being a democracy, Pakistan kind of a pseudo-democracy, Russia, certainly not they did have democratic elections in Russia. In fact, Navalny, who was Russia's, Putin's greatest enemy, actually ran for mayor of Moscow and lost in a legitimate election. But still, Russia's autocratic, and China certainly, called themselves communist. And in many ways, they're run by 7 people or 23 people, depending upon how you look at it. But Pakistan is a Muslim state. India is a Hindu state. And there's all the difference in the world between these religions. And they have had religious wars, India and Pakistan. In fact, they had one, I think, while they were both members of this organization. Yet they continued to come to meetings once a year and agreed on certain economic fundamentals and security fundamentals. And it sort of suggested to me that the East, the Southeast in particular, was basically seeking a way to harmonize secure economic growth and to take that goal, harmonized economic growth, fulfilling economic growth objectives, and separate it from any religious, political, or cultural differences. In other words, maintain your sovereignty and let's all grow together. That philosophy has really taken hold in the Southeast. Recently, the SEO had a meeting. I would say about a month ago, in the mix of the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war was going very strongly. And the members you saw there attending included representatives from the UAE, United Arab Emirates, one of the leading oil powers in the world, Saudi Arabia, which is probably the leading oil power in the world. Well, of course, Russia's right up there. Turkey, Iran, and a multitude of other countries, all wanting membership in this organization. If you took those other countries and included them, and believe me, when you say Iran, well, yeah, Iran has, I mean, you'll never find me saying anything really positive about Iran. But on the other hand, they have growth aspirations and they want to realize them. Saudi Arabia and Iran are almost mortal enemies, as is the UAE. They're different types of Muslims, and one's Shiite and one's Sunni, and that's a major difference. It's more of a difference probably than Catholic. No, it's about Catholic and Jewish. I mean, it's a similar kind of difference. I mean, they both believe in Muhammad, but stops there. I mean, it's a major difference culturally. They're rivals, etc. Yet they're coming together to work together. At the same time, you also have this organization called BRICS. Now, originally, BRICS was a acronym. I think it was originated with Goldman Sachs economist O'Neill. I can't remember his first name. I'm not good on names. But he named it after, it was just BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the basis for that name were these.
South Africa, isn't it?
Now it is.
S is, okay.
Right. The S is for South Africa. Right. Exactly right. They came much later than the original, BRIC countries. And those countries were named because they were emerging economies, but very large and destined to be probably the most important economies in the world in aggregate. And the question was always, can they get along? Can Brazil and Russia and can Russia and China get along? That was a major question. And it has been. I mean, they've had wars, Russia and China. I mean, even in the midst of the Cold War, China and Russia had their own little wars. And, they never really got along that well. And for obvious reasons, they're culturally different, they're ethnically different, they're religiously different, they're politically different, etc. But for the sake of harmonizing economic development and the good of all, they're joining forces, and other countries are now seeking to become part of these two organizations, either BRICS, which now includes South Africa. Turkey wants to be a member of both organizations. Just the other day, Saudi Arabia told the South African chairman or president or whatever they call the leader of their country, Saudi Arabia wants to be part of BRICS. So these countries have vastly expanded, not only their appeal, but their membership waiting list. And I think, and this is kind of rough. I mean, I'm speculating here. Nothing I've said up to now is speculation. It's just what's happening. I mean, you could have been at that meeting and you see pictures of, they make all this, there is a lot of, there's very dishonest and horrible propaganda in the world. And then there's kind of light propaganda. And I would call the war between, or the enmity between, enmity, maybe I have the wrong word, between China and India. It's kind of like light propaganda. I mean, it's about a battle there, a war that they're having 20,000 miles above the surface of the earth, involving a few thousand soldiers on each side. The worst happening, I think, that has happened, the worst thing that's happened in this war is that they had a knife fight, a few of the soldiers. I think people may have been cut. I mean, this is not a reason for two countries their size to have such animosities. Don't believe it. And if you see them at this conference, I mean, they're all together. and all of them, have a lot of things in common. I mean, they are not anti-US, in my opinion. I mean, you and I were talking before, and you mentioned to me that Russia wanted to be part of NATO. Indeed, they did. I mean, even under Putin, it just turned out we refused to give them any help. There's a very famous, a very well-known economist in this country named Jeffrey Sachs, who's head of developmental economics, developing world and the economies of the developing world at Columbia. He's also has a similar post at the United Nations, where he chairs the committee in charge of the developing world. That's what the United Nations is all about. He's one of the most, I would say, one of the most respected economists. And I don't know whether he has a liberal or conservative bent, but I will say this, that he's definitely in favor of this, and he thinks that what the United States has done, he just sees the Ukraine war, for example, as a creation of the United States, by and large, and interfering with any chance to, harmonize economic development. And I guess the point I want to emphasize is that it's possible. The existence of these organizations, some which may go back more than 30 years, SCO, is exemplifies that countries that cannot get along on political, again, religious, and many other bases can still get along in terms of security of economic development. Mm-hmm. And BRICS is the same deal. It's sort of formed. When we talked last time, I don't know whether I would have mentioned BRICS as a significant organization, but what it seems to be, and especially with Saudi Arabia wanting to join both, that seems to be where tremendous progress is being made in a new monetary system. Coincidentally, and a lot of this stuff is just happening in front of us. I mean, it hasn't made news yet. And I become aware of it literally by glancing at a Bloomberg screen. And between the propaganda and the news, sometimes there's news that's there that's really relevant. And one bit of news that I'm sure that, BRICS may have had something to do with, certainly China and Russia did because of their position on gold, is that the World Gold Council, which represents all the gold miners in the world and, is a basic, I guess, industrial source or trade source for gold, is beginning to start, wants to start a worldwide blockchain that covers every gold trade that's made. And this is essentially something that I've argued is going to be necessary in order to have a legitimate new monetary system. It's going to have to bring discipline to our way in which we spend money. I know I've talked, and I don't want to get on, too much off the topic, but my essential point of view about America is that we were a marvelous country at one time. The greatest ever. I mean, in terms of, what democracy represented to us, etc. Vietnam came along and we got through that period. But it was very difficult. I mean, it really did create visions and divisions, but it still didn't totally destroy the underlying respect that people had for other people in this country. I mean, there was, everybody was unique. I mean, we all had our own characteristics, but there was no room for the words better or dumber or more intelligent, more skillful. Those words really didn't apply. They were in the sense that they rated people. Our rating of people was equality, but differences. And it was almost immaterial, something you can't define the differences among people. That was basically what our democracy was created as first line of the the Constitution. We're all created equal. And that was kind of the basis of our democracy. That changed. Mm-hmm. When we were let free for a variety of reasons. I won't go through all of them now. But the net result was that the dollar, which had been linked to gold, and as a link to gold, it basically meant that we could only spend so much money or people would stop owning dollars. And what that did, it created a world in which people that were more skilled at this, more skilled at that, they all had roles to play. And you know, the head of General Motors, for example, which for a time was probably the largest corporation in the country, would meet with other heads of industry and see what they could do to, improve the general economic outlook for everybody. And I still remember my grandfather saying to me, America is a wonderful country because things that are really critical and important in life are not, you're not encumbered by money. You can afford them, like a Gillette razor. That was his example. Everybody can afford a Gillette razor. He happened to be a very well-to-do man that, grew up and became, was an example of the American dream. But a lot of other things wrong with him. But anyway, he was he was a believer in that. I mean, his childhood was so much different than anything that, we can imagine, but he still grew up in this kind of atmosphere. And despite all his foibles and the toughness that he went through, tough life, he still had this kind of innate respect for almost everybody that he saw. He didn't always express it in the nicest ways, but it was there. And that was the kind of democracy that we had. We for instance, Eisenhower was, I considered him to be a very great president. I wasn't around. I'm not that old. I know I may look it, but I don't remember Eisenhower clearly at all. But I know from just reading, he could have run as a Democrat or a Republican. Didn't really matter. It was a Republican choice at the last moment because it was a little bit more convenient. And there wasn't like a major schism between Eisenhower and Stevenson. There wasn't a major schism between Kennedy and Nixon when they ran for president. They were both talking on the same page. I mean, there was a lot of room for agreement. But all this changed, Tom, when we went off the gold standard. We became free to spend as much money as we possibly could. And this has
basically without constraint, right?
Exactly, without constraint. And the results were like a child in a candy store, no constraints. He'll eat until he's, on the floor sick. And basically we spent money until we got very sick. And it's where we are now. And it's really starting to accelerate. We're in just a horrible position. We came to believe very soon after the gold standard. And when I say believe, it was almost a secular religion in this country, not a sacred religion. I think before, whether the people went to church or didn't go to church, there was some, a sacred belief in democracy. It was something that was very hard to express, but you knew what it was. It's like love. I heard that line actually on a show called Borgen. If anyone's curious, it's running on Netflix, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful story of the Danes and their view of democracy. And during that show, they ask a dissident who's fleeing from a so-called democratic state, which is anything but democratic. It's authoritarian. And they ask him on a news program in Denmark. This is all fiction, but it's still true to what Denmark believes, that what's your definition of democracy? And he said that, that's a really tough question because democracy is like love. There's an immaterial aspect. It's different for everybody because we're all different. But at the same time, we can recognize those differences and accept them and talk to people and get along with people no matter what those differences are. And that was America when I was a child growing up. And I still remember it. And it was just wonderful. I mean, because it was such a big country and so important and so dominant in the world that to have this kind of I would say, sacred belief in democracy was very, very special. We've lost all that. I mean, and money did it. I mean, you have to really protect what's valuable, and we did not. Money became the thing that was valuable and really became the measuring stick, and I would call it a secular religion. I mean, maybe not so much now because of all the stuff that's going on, but Bloomberg typically will have, on their headlines, so-and-so gained $50 billion in wealth today, is now rated number 31 in the world in terms of wealth, whereas yesterday he was only rated 33. I mean, who cares? I mean, what does this mean? Does this mean he's happier? Does this mean anything that's really important for anything at all? Does it mean his children are going to grow up and be wonderful? No. Does it preclude that they're not going to get sick or suicide or be totally unhappy? No. Everything, it's my belief that you need something sacred in your life. I'm not talking about a Jewish God, a Christian God, though it could be a Muslim God. I mean, but something sacred has to hold you together, or else you're going to get just swept up in some sort of secular religion. And this happens. Philosophers of, following Hitler or during Hitler's time, became really aware of this, that it was all too easy to become brainwashed and give up whatever secular faith we have. And that has come to pass. Basically, we are a country that until very recently believed that money could solve every problem, no matter what it was. If we threw enough money at it, we would solve it. And instead of really solving things, what we did is we developed a healthcare system that was just a bureaucratic nightmare. And as a result of spending more money than any other developed country per capita, we have the shortest life expectancy. Today, our life expectancy is lower than that of China. And China's healthcare is so much more affordable than our healthcare, it's shocking to me. It's not what I want to see, where I want to see this country. We've done something just terribly wrong, just that one piece of data on educational tests, on let's say, how much do you know about the sciences?
I think this kind of goes back to something that you and I were talking about before we hit record here today, and that's maybe putting aside our left and right biases and disciplines and evaluating some of these policies and the consequences that they could have more like economists, right? Trying to figure out what the downstream consequences of this are, instead of alienating ourselves by, using the dollar as a weapon against the rest of the world.
Right. And measuring our own successes by dollars. I mean, it's just not the way to necessarily do things. I mean, recognize other people's successes, of course, because everybody's different, and some people are going to be good at one thing. Somebody's going to be a superb welder. You can't build a building without having a superb welder. Somebody is going to be a superb manager. And even if you're not a superb welder, you can't build a building without junior welders working for the welder. I mean, and you recognize that all these skills are, I don't want to use a word like God-given, but I mean, but are unique to that person and are not really easily described. And yes, I think you're totally right. When the differences between left and right are, just they're arguments among people that basically agree on where we are, but just have relatively solvable differences in terms of how we get there. Mm-hmm. But you see, once stratification and money becomes involved, then all of a sudden it's gone. Mm-hmm. Where basically our measuring stick is not something internal about the person. Does he enjoy being a welder? Does he enjoy being a manager? Does he enjoy being a musician? No, it becomes how much money does he make? When Babe Ruth, for instance, was probably, in my opinion, I'm not going to get into a baseball argument here, but was probably the greatest baseball player that ever lived. I mean, he was a great pitcher, and I mean, he hit home runs that were 2 or 3 times as many as other people were hitting. I mean, there were no home run races. I mean, there was how many is Babe Ruth going to hit, and then number 2, no one worried about. There were other statistics like batting average and things like that. Despite his accomplishments in the baseball arena, and how much he actually saved baseball in the wake of a huge crisis that occurred, I think, during 1919, the so-called Black Sox. They took money, bribes, et cetera, and they were banned. You know, players were banned, et cetera, and baseball was really on the outs. Babe Ruth saved the game. Despite all this, you know, all his what he contributed to the sport, his salary was, I would guess, maybe a 50th of what we pay our best baseball players today. Today, they're recognized almost by how much money they're paid, as much as, you know, and they trade teams. There's no loyalty. I mean, if you notice, there's, you know, people are always shifting teams, and what determines what team they play on? How much money they get, not the hometown, not their allegiance to anything. And, you know, this is just one small, again, example of, you know, what is happening. What a singer will record will probably be
Steve,
determined.
Maybe let's get back to some of the points that we need to touch on.
Sorry,
here.
Tom. I tend to get carried away. I really
Not a
am
problem.
sorry.
It's all good. I wanted to ask you, maybe let's go back to the idea that you were presenting about all of the gold transactions being linked to a blockchain.
Right.
Do you think that that's going to be a good thing, or is that another example of centralizing a system that could have negative consequences?
I think, Tom, anything can have negative consequences. So will it be easy? No. Will it be tough? I think it's going to be the toughest challenge humanity has ever faced. But if we're going to face this challenge, I think we're dealing with existential challenges today. And when I say money can't solve everything, we've come up to that point in which we realize, I don't care who wins the war in Ukraine. I mean, when I say I don't care, I mean, obviously I don't want a war, period. I don't want to see people die, but I think Russia will prevail, even though there might be a couple of more setbacks. And if I had to guess, I would say there's going to be no Ukraine later on. But, you know, what Ukraine has meant, even if I'm wrong on who will actually prevail, doesn't matter, because what it has showed the world is that money cannot solve all the problems. You cannot buy the resources you need to run your economy with money if the resources are not available. And there is this crazy inequality in resource distributions in which the rising countries of the world, which are now larger in total than the developed countries of the world, let's say the G7, you know, U.S., Canada, France, Italy, Germany. Sorry, I left out a couple, but, you know, all the developed countries in the world are now smaller and considerably smaller than the developing countries. And that's a first. And these countries now have far greater resource endowment, and we can see this. Germany, which was one of our greatest manufacturers behind the U.S. I think China's number one, but among the developed countries, there was the U.S. and China. I mean, the U.S. and Germany. We were talking beforehand. You raised the point, which I really didn't know. But, you know, Germany is probably going to be forced to shut down their steel mills because they don't have enough energy. And as you pointed out to me, that's the end of the steel mill. That's the deindustrialization of Germany. You don't shut a steel mill down for a week and then say, okay, let's start it back up again. No, it's much, much more complicated than that, and usually end up building a new steel mill, which is going to require massive amounts of resources. Resources are scarce.
And time as well.
And time, exactly. And we cannot afford not to develop these resources, and we cannot afford not to be friends with countries that we might totally disagree with, that might have a completely different view of the world than we do. And they all have to be included. And coming back to a gold standard, there has to be something that people can agree on from different countries that represent how money should be efficiently, or how resources should be efficiently allocated. And money should be designed really for this purpose. I mean, for other purposes too, but that has to be a fundamental purpose. There are too many people in this world that have too many countries in this world that have massive amounts of resources. The Congo comes to mind. I mean, certainly I don't want to move to the Congo, but I will accept the fact that they're critical to the development of this world. I mean, all the corruption and everything else, I mean, you have to tolerate it for a while. I think the underlying thinking is that the world can develop. Maybe we'll come together a little bit more. We may never agree. We can all keep our sovereignty, but this is what I think the SCO and now BRICS has shown us. It's possible for countries with cultures and religions and political philosophies so different from one another to come together. And what I think you need is this monetary system that imposes discipline on what the world can do, not just what the U.S. can do. I mean, the gold standard imposed limits and discipline on what the developed countries could do. And they developed very, very quickly. All today's discoveries, I mean, we've advanced them, but the basis, the foundations of today's technologies, everything from the transistor to the laser, to the telephone, to the internet, to anything you can name, occurred when this country was, as I formerly described it, when they were on the gold standard. And you know why? They had to. They were forced to invent because they only had a certain amount of money available to them. So unless they created the means and the technologies for growth, they weren't going to grow. I mean, you know, now growth for us is if the finance industry, you know, increases and salaries go up, double or triple or quadruple. That's growth. That's how we define it. Money has become a secular religion. If you want to get away from that, and I don't care what you consider to be your sacred belief, but whatever makes you really unique is kind of sacred. You can't describe it, just like the man that was asked this question on that show, Borgen. Mm-hmm. What is democracy? It's love, like love. You can't describe it. It's different for everybody. And that has to be sort of where we come to and accept, at least U.S., I don't know about China, whether they accept that. I don't know about Russia, whether they'll ever accept that kind of thing. But regardless, if we accept it, it's enough for us. And it will allow us to accept others. I mean, the philosophy of this country since we went off the gold standard has been, we're the best country in the world. I mean, this is the neocon philosophy. And we should extend what we believe in to every other part of the world, even though they want to reject it. And just this belief that we should extend what we believe undercuts what we believe, if that makes sense to you. You can't believe that everybody is unique and everybody's entitled to their own kinds of beliefs, and then at the same time impose your own belief in this system on others, which is exactly what we've been trying to do. It's totally contradictory.
So Steve, on the other side of, let's say, working together as the BRICS seem to be able to do, and the SCO, despite their individual beliefs, they seem to be able to, or seemingly at this point, seem to be able to come together and work together. On the other side of that, let's talk a little bit about Europe. Is Italy trying to launch their own currency, and what kind of consequences could that have for the rest of Europe?
It could have, I mean, I think NATO is basically finished at this point. When you hear that Turkey wants to join both BRICS and SCO, and is now joined with Qatar and Putin to make a new way of distributing gas to Europe, but it's through what's known as the Turk Stream, which is a gas pipeline from Russia to Turkey. And that's going to be dramatically enlarged if this agreement comes into force, and Turkey will be the center for distribution of gas, which is one, obviously major change. Italy definitely wants to get out of Europe. The EU, what's holding them in there are non-elected bureaucrats in Brussels that have control of the euro, and their money's now the euro. So, it's hard to break away from the euro, but I think they'll be able to do it. And I think eventually what you see now is you see Macron and Scholz, the leader of Germany, who really has not distinguished himself as a great leader compared to Merkel. But anyway, both of them are making separate trips to China. I mean, this to me is an indication that you're already seeing Europe divide up, disintegrate as a bloc, and willing to trade with China. If they lose China as a trading partner, I think you can write Europe off. I mean, if I can just digress for a second, I think there's very little. All the evidence that I see, I don't know, and I want to emphasize, I don't know this for sure, but it seems clear from everything I've seen that the attack on the Nord Stream was something done, if not solely by the U.S. The U.S. had a major role in it, and they even said it before it happened. Biden in a press conference, I think before the Ukraine war started, and this is record, you can go to YouTube, you can find it. He was asked about, I guess, the Nord Stream, and he said, if Russia goes into the Ukraine, there'll be no more Nord Stream. He said, one of the reporters said, Mr. President, how can you say that? He said, you'll see. Literally, I mean, that's not
make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll make it happen. Victoria Nuland, who's a Russian phobe to the end, said almost exactly the same thing. She was there in the 2014 uprising, which a lot of people, including Jeremy Sachs that I mentioned before, thought was engineered by the U.S. I have no opinion on that. It could have been, wouldn't shock me at all. They had a pro-Russian leader. He was gone. But you're talking about Europe. I think it's becoming clear Europe's going to have to go its own way. I mean, one thing said about the Nord Stream, and why I say that, in addition to what Victoria Nuland and Biden said, there's also other evidence. Sweden, for instance, it was done in Swedish waters, has walked away from the investigation. The Polish minister, one of the top figures in Poland, has held many posts. He's married to a vicious Russian phobe from the U.S. and Applebaum. He, in the wake of the destruction of the Nord Stream, this is record of this too. You can go to YouTube or wherever. Actually, you probably go to Twitter. He congratulated the his words to the U.S., thank you very much, when the Nord Stream was destroyed. In Germany, now this is very, very interesting. Germany said the other day they know who destroyed the Nord Stream, but they can't say for security reasons. Now, if they know who did it, and in Sweden, they may or may not know, they probably do know, but they just said they're walking away from the investigation. If any of these countries know, it's not Russia, or else they would say it's Russia, Russia's fighting Ukraine, and everybody on Europe is supposedly on the side of Ukraine. They're not so much anymore. But they would say it was Russia. Clearly wasn't Russia. You can rule Russia out, which means it may have been Britain participating, even could have been the Ukraine participating. The U.S. had a role. That's a mass terrorist act. Now, if you're German and you're aware that your ally, your major ally in the post-war period, very likely, at least according to what you believe, committed terrorist act against your nation. I mean, the people that suffer here are not the United States or Britain. It's the people in Europe. They're the ones that now are going to have to really gut it out until there's other sources of energy available to them, and very, very hard to find. Hopefully they'll eventually do it. are you really going to trust the U.S. to be your ally and a major trading partner? I mean, I heard another from a YouTube station I totally respect. I mean, I think they're British. They're very, I think they're honest, and they really try and do their best at presenting what is happening out there. And I listen to them. I listen to you too. So, I mean, there are very few, but I do listen. I mean, it's taken me a while to narrow it down. But they were arguing the other day that, maybe the U.S. just has so much power over these countries like France and Germany, et cetera, that they can just keep them under their, auspices. And as a consolation prize, I mean, they're basically conceding that the happenings in Ukraine, and its ramifications and what it's shown everybody in the eastern part of the world, the Southeast, et cetera, says that the United States can no longer be alone as a hegemon. These days are gone. They're not a trusted ally, to say the least. And from Germany's point, to say that they're an enemy is probably more accurate than saying they're an ally. If someone destroys your source of energy, it was the Germans that initiated the Nord Stream, just for the record. It was under Merkel, who was actually pretty friendly with Putin, that they developed the Nord Stream. That was a German-Russian project. And the United States are the most credible. As I said, I wasn't there, and it's wrong, and I could be totally wrong in a way I hope I am. But everything that I've heard that's credible says that the United States had a major role in a totally terrorist act that put its allies in an incredibly precarious position. Now, this one blog, just to be fair, is arguing the United States is seeking a consolation prize. They want to control the developed world as their consolation prize. They realize that they're not going to ever control China or Russia. I mean, some argue their reason for denying the one request Russia had, and they were ready to negotiate at the beginning of the war, and again, lots of sources on this, was that they didn't want NATO involved. They didn't want NATO to be extended to the Ukraine, or else we would have a U.S. missile crisis again. And people like, again, Jeremy Sachs currently saying the same thing, John Matlack, who goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and is in his 90s, saying the same thing. Keenan, who passed away in 2005, saying the same thing, but he was considered probably the dean of foreign relations. I mean, this has been something that's been trumpeted by, people that have really spent their life studying it. You can't surround a major country with missiles, or else, just like the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came close to extinction. And all Russia wanted, I mean, they allowed NATO to extend to, through the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, et cetera, to their border. But, we broke a promise that, and there's plenty of record of this, that was negotiated under the first George Bush, that if Gorbachev agreed to, unifying Germany, we would never extend NATO further than Germany. That's where it would stop, hard stop. It would never go to the borders of Russia. And initially, as you pointed out to me, and I agree, I mean, it's true, Russia initially wanted to be part of NATO. They did. We were the ones that rejected them. And I keep coming back to Jeffrey Sachs because he's a guy that's credible. He has his only dog in the game is developing the world. I mean, that's what he wants. That's what he loves. That's his obsession. He's a U.S. citizen. He works at Columbia. He's dedicated American. But, he speaks of the differences between Poland and Russia. He was managing the economies of both countries after the Cold War ended. And his comment was, he said, I have a study. This is an actual thing that happened. That in Poland's case, he said, look, this is what I'm recommending for these countries that want to become democratic now that the Cold War is over. I think what they need is stern monetary discipline, control of their money supply, but at the same time, they need fiscal spending. They don't have the money to develop their infrastructure. And he requested whatever it was, some billions of dollars for Poland. It took him, he said, I think 6 hours to get a yes answer from the United States. He called them up. For Russia, same thing. He said, we're going to impose, monetary discipline on this country, but we're going to need help money-wise to, help the country build up their infrastructure, etc. They said, no way. Don't ever bring up Russia again. This has been the position, and I hate to say it, of Joe Biden. There's an article in the New York Times when they were debating this extension of NATO, where Monahan, who was probably, he was a Democrat all his life. He was a good Democrat, he was like what I was calling before, the kind of democracy you want to see. He served both Nixon and Kennedy, and then ended up a New York Democrat. He was also head of the United Nations, U.S. ambassador. There was an argument in this is from the New York Times. You go to the archives, you can read the article. And the article describes the debate in the Senate, and it describes Monahan as literally saying, if we approve these initial extensions of NATO, we are opening up something that we have no idea what we're getting into, meaning this could be a crisis of incredible magnitude, really echoing words of people like Keenan and Matlack, who had seen it in person. Guess who stood up in the Senate, turned red-faced? This is all according to the New York Times. I'm not quoting them, but you believe me, there's no difference. Waving his hands, red-faced, interrupting, just like I'm probably doing now, but I'm not running the country, so I can get away with it. But this was none other than Joe Biden, who had always been a fierce Russian phobe, hated the Russians. I don't know why. Maybe he saw Dr. Strangelove too many times and believed that it was true. I have no idea. But he acted. The New York Times concluded their argument by Biden saying to another senator who was on Monahan's side, and he was taking up his time, he said, I'm sorry, I'm just very confused. Well, now, what this convinced me of two things is, one, whatever inadequacies Joe Biden may have, they may not be due to age. The fact that he's approaching 80. I've heard Charlie Munger at 100, and he's very, very articulate on YouTube. Everybody should listen to Charlie Munger at 100. And he's also been Buffett's partner for about 50 years. So he doesn't talk about his money. I mean, he talks about loving his job. If you listen to people like Buffett and Munger talk, they say, well, why are we so long-lived? Because we love what we're doing. It's not because we're becoming the richest people in the world or so rich. But Munger's worth listening to. Biden today is the same Biden that said back in 1998, well, I'm sorry, it's just that I'm totally confused. And he's still confused. And he still views Russia as an existential enemy. And, my argument would be, what these people see in Russia is a massive source of resources, and they've come to realize that we don't have the resources here. Fracking was a boondoggle of major proportions and an illustration of what harm money can do. Because of all this money these companies were funded with, they ended up on balance, on cash balance and kind of opportunity costs. I've tried to do the best calculations I can. At least $500 billion we lost. More than that loss in producing that oil all at once is now the Permian Basin. All these basins are a shadow of what they once were. They were able to make up whatever increases in oil the world might have needed for about a decade. And that's why oil prices were way too low during that decade. It was something that we created through fracking and through the money that we were able to spend with impunity. And it basically destroyed fundamentally our independence. We're now not independent on oil anymore. And, the sign of this is Biden's already released a tremendous proportion of these 600 million barrels of oil that we had in reserve for rainy days. This is not a rainy day. You haven't seen anything yet. I mean, climate change and everything else is going to require tremendous amounts of resources. Copper is so energy intense, and we're in Chile, especially because we've mined so much copper in Chile that the amount of energy we need to get additional copper out of Chile is enormous, and it might increase exponentially. If we don't make friends with the East, and I'm including Africa, look, China has $1 billion, they've put about $1 trillion into what they call the Belt Road Initiative. And yes, everybody comes out with the propaganda and says it's debt to China, criticizes it. Nonsense. They need it. The Africans need it. The Pakistanis need it, etc. They're not interfering with their political stances. They don't care. I mean, it's growth together with security. We have to have this philosophy. If we don't, either all the world is going to be destroyed. It's not going to make it. It's going to be a catastrophe. You asked about Europe. Yes, ditto. And I think they see it. I think they're a little bit more advanced. I think their actual relationship with Russia borders them. Obviously, that's why we have all this trouble. They have a much closer relationship to Russia than we do. And they would accept Russia. And no doubt they've been leading trading partners with China. They're not sanctioning China. All these sanctions have backfired, incidentally, not just the sanctions on oil, which have destroyed Europe in effect. I'm not exaggerating, but the sanctions on China, which have basically helped destroy a lot of our technology industry because they no longer have the research and development to improve technologies. Again, they're stuck where they were at the end of the gold standard. Most of our technologies, there's been tweaks. That's all there is. The basis, the foundations all occurred while we had some sort of discipline and we had to develop them. Now we don't. Now we can just spend more money, or so we thought. But now that's coming to an end. All of a sudden, China's the first country to develop supercomputers. China's more advanced in quantum computers, and who knows what else they're advanced in. They used to brag about it because they were proud of themselves. And now they don't even say what they're advanced in. But I mean, anyone that believes that, first of all, I don't think there's a chance there's a chance. The only way China will ever use physical force against Taiwan, in my opinion, is if Americans fire on China from Taiwan bases. Then they may actually have to do it. The reaction, the most severe reaction, if you just step back, and maybe this will be my last point. I am not a Chinophile. I don't want to live under China. I want to live under democracy, but the kind of democracy that sort of forced us to, create and treat people as equals, that kind of democracy. China doesn't want to fight either. Name me a fighting war that China's been in. And you probably have to go back to Korea, where they were kind of forced to fight. Name me a war that the U.S. has not been in. And, it's very rare. What countries in the East have we not fought with one way or the other? The worst thing that you saw from China, and I'll kind of conclude with this, wasn't a war. In the wake of Pelosi's cynical, just mindless visit to Taiwan, not because it's mindless that a politician go there and, shake hands, but mindless because it was done solely for the objective of provoking China. What China did was very simple. They fired a lot of bombs. They had a lot of ships in the sea, the Taiwan Strait that separates Taiwan from mainland China. Enough firepower. No one was killed. Incidentally, in terms of the Hong Kong riots that China is so taken to task for, name me anybody killed in those riots. Maybe one person because he fell from a stadium floor. There's a lot of talk that those riots were basically the result of U.S. provocation. I don't know whether that's true. But the point is, if they were even real riots, China wasn't after killing people. Name me a riot in this country where people aren't killed. By contrast, those riots went on for a year? They were so intense, you read about them every day, but not one death that came from a gunshot or anything. The Chinese army itself was always on the sidelines. But anyway, that's what that's what China said to the West. And an admiral from the U.S. Navy came along and said, yes, if China wants to, they can blockade Taiwan, which means blockading the Taiwan Strait, keep every boat, ship, plane out of Taiwan. They have that kind of military capacity. And one reason they have it is because we don't cooperate with China. There's this thing about rare earths. I'm sorry, this will be my very last point, but it's an interesting point and it's never been brought up. We are now trying to develop rare earths. I mean, I warned about this in my first book on China, which was called Red Alert. And just the title of that book, incidentally, should tell you I'm not a Chinophile. I was warning against China. Didn't want to be part of China. I said, this is what they're doing. And one big advantage they have over us is rare earths. You cannot build so-called permanent magnets without rare earths, period. And you can read white papers from generals in the Air Force, U.S. Air Force, that say without a complete complement of rare earths, your army might be great, but its technology capacity will be limited to what it was in 1979. The one country that has a complete capacity of all rare earths is China. Now, China up to now has been refining our rare earths. We do have an ore body and, we can't refine it, but we're building up our refining capacity. Guess what? It's not going to make any difference because this ore body does not include one critical element. I can't pronounce it. The symbol is chemical symbol Y. Not there. Trace amounts. Only China ore bodies have it. Now, I don't know, but I would doubt if they were ever giving us a full complement of rare earths. They certainly haven't been lately. And, that's one of the things you see in the Ukraine right now. And another argument for cooperation is that our missiles are not nearly as accurate as the Russian missiles. Russia does have a full complement thanks to China. China's been helping Russia in this war. There's no doubt about it. I think it's wrong in a way, but, it is what it is. And the accuracy of these hypersonic missiles are just unbelievable. General Milley, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when China launched a hypersonic missile that went around the globe and hit a target within a couple of miles, I'm not sure how many miles, but almost a bullseye after circling the globe at hypersonic speeds, Milley came out and said initially, this is a Sputnik moment. In other words, for those that don't remember Sputnik, this is when Russia launched that satellite around space and it woke Kennedy up. We're going to put a man on the moon. And we did. That was that was before when we were on the gold standard. We were capable of doing things like that. And that proved it. In response to Sputnik, we exceeded everybody. And if we could get back to that with our democracy the way it was, U.S. could still be tops in technology. We're not now. We don't have the most accurate missiles. We haven't explored for minerals on the moon, as China has done. We don't have the best supercomputers. All we have are sanctions against China that are backfiring more subtly, but in the same way those economic sanctions backfired against Europe. Russia right now, their economy, this is according to The Economist, the most pro-Western newspaper you can find, their economy is out of a recession. They're growing at about 4% a year. We're in the midst of an unfightable economy. We cannot achieve what we want. We've destroyed the Federal Reserve in simple words. We can't fight inflation and growth at the same time. Furthermore, if we're fighting a war, we're going to have to accept high inflation, or we're going to have to cripple this economy so that we really do lose this war. I mean, if Russia's growing in the context of all, they're growing and Europe can't make steel. Now, this is how our sanctions have come full around. Once they governed the world, now they are just totally backfiring. Our alternatives, Tom, are either to cooperate or, I think, face extinction. And, I don't think the latter is possible. I'm seeing signs in the media now that suggests that cooperation is more open. These trips that Macron and Schultz are making to China suggest that they believe that they don't have to compromise anything concerning their sovereignty. with dealing with China as opposed to dealing with the U.S. We're forcing them to compromise their sovereignty. To put it in mildly, they can't build steel anymore. How much more compromise can there be? That won't happen with China. China will provide them with the materials and the energies, not directly because they're not to do it. So, I think we're at a critical point. Things have accelerated. You started out this discussion by asking me what progress have we made with BRICS and I guess SCO by implication. It's been enormous. Mm-hmm. And I think the U.S. may now be at a point where they realize that the only way out for us is through cooperation. And furthermore, they have models in front of them that suggests that cooperation doesn't mean sacrificing anything that we regard as part of our sovereignty. On the contrary, it may be exactly what we need to get back to the kind of democracy that I can say I love, that I want us to get back to, that I want my children, their progeny, your progeny, all our progenies to have in the 21st century. This could become the greatest country in the world. Again, because, we'll be free to have a democracy that's great and China may not. And under those terms, there's not going to be a battle. I think we'll probably surpass them. And I don't think China will mind because of what China is. They don't go to war over things like this. We do. And it's just cost us. But I think, we are at such a critical point in the history of human civilization. It's just hard to overstate it. And all of it depends upon the choices we make right now. Are we willing to cooperate as Germany and France and Italy? And, the Euro's no longer going to be, the Eurozone is no longer going to exist. That's gone, as in answer to your question. I think that the idea of cooperation now is front and center in Europe's mind. I think more and more in the U.S. mind. And if we can get around this, and I don't care whether it's a Democrat, a Republican, or who, I don't think those labels matter at all. All that matters is you elect someone who loves democracy and wants the best for this country and wants it to remain that way. And we will end up cooperating and end up being a wonderful, wonderful country again. Maybe I'm utopian, but that's what I believe can happen.
I hope, the powers that be are sober enough to realize that we do need to cooperate and that we do need to work together with other countries to be able to get out of this worldwide problem that
absolutely,
fiat currencies in some ways have directly caused, but
they've become
time will
deity.
Absolutely tell. Mm-hmm.
They've become our deity. We need to get back to the immaterial in a way that we're all unique people, which is what our founding fathers saw. Mm-hmm. And that's how they wrote the Constitution. Let's pay a little bit more attention to, freedom of religion, freedom of press, and things like that, all designed to create an equality among people. Certain people are going to be better at certain things, other people better, but everybody can be happy and work together. We have to get back to what the founding fathers wanted for this country. And believe me, I'm a lifelong Democrat speaking like this, like I'm an originalist with the Constitution. I'm not really a total originalist, but this concept has to embody America if we're ever going to be America again. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap up today's conversation, Steve. Thank you so much for your time today. Of course, a list of your articles and books are available at stephenleeb.com and also your Twitter handle at LeebPhD. Steve, thanks so much for your time today.
Tom, I'm sorry I took too much of your time, but really, it's always a great, great pleasure to talk with you. You give me so much information and really do help me in with your knowledge, et cetera. So again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you too. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.